In this segment, we'll be looking at a typical mortise cylinder. Now, mortise cylinders are used in doorknobs, and in this segment, we'll be looking at the typical mortise cylinder lock. Now, mortise cylinder locks are commonly used in doors and homes, among other applications as well, but the most common use of them is indoors. Now, if we look at a typical mortise lock, what we have here is we have the plug that goes in the center of the lock, and that's the part that turns with the key. And you can see on the back side here, we have a lever which allows the mechanism to work. So as you turn the key, you're going to move that lever. Now let's take a look how that works. So to operate the lock, what we would do is we would put the key in the lock, and as you turn the key, you can see it turns the lever on the back of the lock. So that's what opens and releases the lock mechanism itself, is when we put the key in, that allows it to turn the lever, and that releases the lock on the door. Now you'll notice, now in a typical mortise lock, what you'll notice is you have threads here that run along the outside of the lock. That's what helps it retain it in the door itself. The lock is mounted in the hole, and the nut retainer goes on the back side to tighten it up and hold it in tight in place. When you're going through this threaded area, you can see that right here is actually a little slot milled in the lock. As you look at this threaded area, you can see one particular space. As you look around this threaded area, you can see one area here is milled out, and there's actually a flat metal plate that's placed in there. Now this flat metal plate, what that does is cover the top holes of the lock. So the pins that go down into the lock are actually holes that are drilled down below this plate. You can see that lines up with the plug here, so your top pins would be right above the key slot. So what happens is when they make the lock, they drill those holes, they mill the slot out, and then to keep the springs and pins on the lock, there's a plate that actually covers over the top of the hole here. Now, if you ever had to get this plate out, the trick to it here is, if you can see, it's actually slid in from the back. If you try to pry it up, it's not going to work. It doesn't pry in from the top, it actually slides out the back. And usually what they do with the manufacturer is they'll peen over the end here a little bit with a hammer so it locks it in place. So to get this plate out, if you ever had to, you'd actually have to file off the back of the lock here a little bit and then pry the plate out towards the back. Now as far as rekeying goes, what we have to do to rekey a lock like this is to take the cylinder plug out and change the lower pins. Now there's a couple. To rekey a lock like this, to repin a lock like this, what you'd have to do is disassemble the lock and take the cylinder plug out, change the lower pins, and then reassemble the lock together. Now the cylinder plug here slides out from this end, the key side end. What holds it in place is this plate in the back. You can see there's two screws that hold that plate on. So to get the plug out, what we have to do is remove those screws, take the end plate off, and slide the plug out. Now there's some things to be careful of, because you got to remember we want to keep the top pins still in the lock. So we don't want the top pins and the springs flying out of the lock when we do this. So once you take that plate off the back here, this plug will slide out pretty easily. So you want to be careful when you're taking this plate off that you don't allow that plug to slide out. What we have is a special tool that we'll use to push it out, and that tool will actually hold all the pins in the lock, the top pins and the springs, while we take the cylinder plug out. If not, what happens is the springs are all going to drop out of the lock, and we have to start and rebuild the lock from scratch. Now the tool. Now the tool that we use to get the plug out is called a cylinder removal tool. It's usually a piece of plastic or nylon, round and cylinder size. Now the tool that we use to get the plug out is called a cylinder removal tool. And it's basically what it is. It's a long round cylinder, usually made of nylon or plastic. And you can see it has a little notch milled in the end of it. And how this works is we would take the plate off the end of the lock. And you can see there's a little tab that fits into that plate. That tab will fit into the slot of our plug follower tool here. So what we do is we line that up, and then we can push this plug through as it pushes the lock cylinder out. As this goes through, the top pins and springs will be held in place by the plastic plug here, follower. That way they won't come out of the lock. So what we can really do is unbolt that, slide that plug out carefully, and take our plug out and change the lower pins without disturbing the top pins. Now it's important that we keep good pressure on this when we push through. Keep steady pressure so we don't allow any of those pins to drop out. And then once we get it in, we don't want to pull this plug out. If you pull this plug out without having a cylinder in there, all the pins are going to fall out of the lock. So let's disassemble this lock. The first step we're going to do is remove these two screws that are in the back. There's two Phillips head screws that hold this plate on. What we do is take a screwdriver, take the plate off. So we take each of the screws out, carefully pull them out. Now while I'm doing this, you can see on the bottom here I have my finger on the bottom of the plug here, so I keep that from dropping out. So once we remove this plate, we don't want the plug to fall out of the lock. So we take the screws out, be careful you don't lose them. Okay, now that we have the screws out of this plate, we can take this plate right off the lock. Now remember, I'm keeping my finger on the bottom here to keep that plug from falling out. We don't want the plug to fall out of the back. What we want to do is push it out with our plug follower tool. So we have our tool here, we have our tang sticking out of the plug. We want to line those up. And once we have them lined up, what we're going to do is push that out. What you do is push that out. Now, before we can push that out, we have the lock pins all down in the plug. So what we want to do is get them all on the shear line. So what we want to do is put our key into the lock. Now for this plug to slide out, we have to have all the pins on the shear line, so we have to insert our key into the lock. You can do this ahead of time, or you can do it after you've gotten the plate off. Either way is fine. Okay, now that we have the plate off, we have our key inserted. We have our plug follower tool lined up with the notch. We should be able to slide that plug right out.